All right, y'all. How's everybody doing? Man, I was rocking out in this office. You won't believe it. We were getting loud, and nobody could hear me. That's what I love about this place. Empty, nobody for as far as I can see. And I can just get as crazy as I want. How's everybody doing today? We are in week 4. Week 4. We are almost a quarter of the way done with this semester. Can you guys believe that? We are getting this semester done. I hope everybody's doing well. Good to see you, Alan. I got your email, and I'm still composing a good response to you. Alan wanted to know what my point of view was on this past week's discussion board about the political parties and alternate realities. And I'm still trying to craft a really good professional psychological response for you, Alan. But I am going to post it on the announcements page so anybody else who's interested can see what Crazy Dr. Roddenberry thought about this week's discussion board. Okay, everybody doing well? I don't see a lot of chats so far. Blow up my chat bar real quick and let me know you're still there, everybody. And then we'll get started. Who we got? 12 people on. A small but awesome audience. I see we got Yasmin there. Good to see you. Omar, how you doing? Hi, Caitlin Whitaker. Okay, good enough. We got the gang is all here. Fantastic. Hello. Whoop, whoop. Yeah, Matt. Haley Hammett. Luke T. Isaac Murado. Jordan Pluterman. Fantastic. Wow, what a great audience. I'm super excited to see everybody. Quick announcement, don't forget, exam number 4 is this weekend. The exam will open on Friday, and you will have all weekend to do the exam. It's due Sunday night by 11:59. Yes, it is. Holy cow, Whitaker. It is exam week. The exam questions should be pretty similar in style and type to the homework questions. In fact, I would go use the homework questions as one of my study tools. Follow the learning objectives in each chapter. I created the exams looking at the learning objectives, so hopefully that will give you a good direction to go. And be sure to look at your book and your PowerPoints. Okay. How's everybody doing? Wow, we spun up to 19 people. Cool. Say, if anybody has a music recommendation for Dr. Roddenberry, I love new music. I listen to the old, I'm an old guy, so I listen to the 70s and 60s rock too, but I listen to 80s rock, 90s. I like it all. I like rap music, not as much as I like rock, but I like rap music. I like rhythm and blues. I like rhythm R&B music. Actually, Camille Cabello is one of my favorite singers in the whole world. Oh my God, her songs are just so sexy and cool. So please feel free to share your music taste with Dr. Roddenberry. That's how I learned about the Black Keys and oh my God, Avenged Sevenfold, another one of my favorite bands. I learned about those through student recommendations. So, of course, I listened to Greta Van Fleet. Sounds a little too close to Led Zeppelin, but man, that lead singer can wail, right? Wouldn't you think, Omar? That guy has got a voice. Sounds to me just like Robert Plant. Actually, the whole band sounds like Zeppelin. They are freaking awesome. That guitarist can rock. Yeah, the classic Zeppelin and Floyd. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Cool. Anybody like George Clinton? P-Funk, Parliament, Funkadelic. That's a good band you should check out if you like kind of funky dance music as well. And I will check out Example, Kira K. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and get started, shall we, today? Today's chapter 4, we're talking about developmental psychology. If you remember the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing on the subfield of psychology I would call biopsychology. So chapter 2 was specifically about biopsychology. And then I told you last week, chapter 3, the kind of psychologists you're usually going to have studying sleep are usually going to be biological psychologists, okay? Now, this is our second subfield. That is a professional specialty. Remember from chapter 1, We talked about the professional subfields of psychology. I'm a social psychologist. You can be a clinical psychologist. You can be a biological psychologist. This week we're talking about Chapter 4, which is developmental psychology. And developmental psychology is one of the areas or subfields of psychology that you can get a professional degree in. It'll actually say it on your diploma when you get it. Okay, and what we're going to talk about today is, in developmental psychology, I should say before I get started, is interested in how people change over the course of their lifespan, from the time you are conceived, right, when the egg meets the sperm, all the way from then until you die. Okay, so we're interested in how human beings change and grow and develop. Now, most people, when they think of developmental psychology, they think of kids, but you know what? Development is lifelong. And so we're going to talk a little bit about changes in the teenage years and adulthood even this week. And if you folks find this chapter interesting, my next class, the one that I teach, the advanced level class I teach above this, is Psych 241, Developmental Psychology. It's a really cool class, and if you like my Psych 150 class, I'm going to suggest that you sign up for Psych 241 in the fall, where we'll be learning all about developmental psychology. But let's go on and get started. We're going to talk about why the developmental perspective is important. We're going to talk about how we evaluate children to make sure they are infants to make sure they are developing healthy. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the milestones in human development language and this thing called infant attachment. And I'm going to drop in and talk a little bit about cognitive development late in childhood. So we're going to talk about 3 different areas of developmental psychology today. We got a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. Lifespan development. You know, developmental psychology is one of the most important areas of psychology. I think outside of intro, it's the most important class you can take. It's more important than abnormal psychology. It's more important than social psychology. It's more important, in my opinion, than biological psychology, because lifespan development is all about helping human beings live longer, healthier, happy lives. I don't know if you knew this, but in 1900, a little over 100 years ago, the average lifespan was 47 years of age. That meant that half of us would be dead by the time we reached 47. You know what? Infant mortality was really, really high, and only 3% of the population was older than 65. Now, if you look at this graph right beside me, you'll see that blue line, and that represents the survival curve for people in 1900. Look at how a bunch of people died the first year of life, and then that line sort of slopes all the way down, and relatively few people made it to 90. Right? Now in 2000, the average lifespan of people is 79. That means you've got at least a 50% chance of living to be at least 79, folks. Infant mortality is way down, and you know what? A surprising 15% of our population is older than 65. And in 2030, there's belief that in some parts of the world, the average lifespan will be 90. That is, 50% of us will live to be at least 90. And if you look over into that graph right beside me, you'll see the 2 different curves that demonstrate this newer lifespan. Why do we live much longer lives? Why do people live so healthy and happy? Because lifespan development has allowed us to evaluate the factors that make human beings live healthy, happy life, okay? Now, lifespan development. This is in a psychology course, so we're going to attack it from the psychology perspective. But you know what? All kinds of people are interested in developmental lifespan development. You've got biologists, geneticists, anthropologists, sociologists. All kinds of different people are going to be interested in how human beings grow and change over the course of the lifespan. But today we're going to talk about it from just a psychological point of view. Now, as we get started, what we're going to do today is we're going to handle 3 different topics, and they're going to relate to the different domains of lifespan development, of human development. Now, when you think about people growing up, you might ask yourself, how do they grow up? Well, they grow up in 3 broad ways. People grow physically, right? So we're going to talk about how the brain and body change as we grow up. And we're going to talk about the factors that allow you to live a biologically healthier life. And I'm going to try to explain to you how 1-year-old brains are different from 15-year-old brains, which are different from 50-year-old brains, right? And that's sort of physical development. How many of you were the tallest kid in your 4th grade class? How many of you were the shortest kid like me in your 4th grade class? That's what we would call your physical development. And we're also going to talk about a different area in which people grow, and that's how their minds grow, their cognitive development. So we're going to talk about the difference between how a 1-year-old thinks and how a 5-year-old thinks and how an 18-year-old thinks as well. And that represents this biological development is going to cause our brain, our mental abilities to change and evolve as we get older. And if you've ever had a discussion with a 3-year-old and found out that they're not very good at conversations, you know exactly what I'm talking about when we're talking about cognitive and mental change. And then we're also going to talk about the third area, which is socio-emotional development, or how the personality develops as we grow up. What do you folks know about infants? What do they do all the time? They cry because they can't control their emotions, right? Have you folks ever heard of the terrible twos? Yes, this is a time when kids grow up and they have trouble controlling their impulses. We're going to talk about the difference in your ability to control your impulses as an 18-year-old and my ability to control my impulses as a 50-year-old. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how personality changes. So you can think of human beings as changing in these 3 broad ways. Maybe you were the tallest kid in the class, but your reading was a little bit behind everybody else's. Maybe you were really smart, but you were a little more immature than your classmates. We're going to talk about these 3 domains of human development. Everybody following me so far? If you understand what I'm saying, go ahead and type in the chat bar for me. So the first thing we're going to talk about, remember I told you that developmental psychology is very helpful, or the lifespan development is very helpful in that it has extended the quality and length of our lives. So what I want to do first is talk about the biological domain of development. And your book talks specifically about the prenatal and the early years of development. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that to start with. Let's talk about biological development. And your book starts with prenatal development. You know, what you do affects your baby. I've got 2 kids. I don't know if any of you have children yet, but one of the things that you really want more than anything else is to have a healthy baby that's got all their fingers and toes and their mind is developed right. And one of the things we worry about as parents is our kids' physical health. So your book decides to talk a little bit about the things that can affect how healthy your children can turn out to be. First, it talks about prenatal development. That's where the story starts. It doesn't start when you're born. It starts when you're conceived. And it talks about prenatal development and what happens during prenatal development. If you look at this chart below me, you'll see that it's broken up into 3 stages: the germinal period, the embryonic period, and the fetal period. These represent 3 different periods of development that occur when you go from conception to birth. The first is called the germinal period. This is when the egg is fertilized and by the sperm, floats down the fallopian tube and implants in the uterine wall. It occurs from 0 to 2 weeks, and it's sort of you're at your highest risk for miscarriage during these first, actually the germinal period and the embryonic period as well, right? And so this is when miscarriage is most likely to happen. The second period goes from 3 to 8 weeks. Now it begins when your nervous system starts developing. So you've got this ball of cells called a blastocyst. In about 2 or so weeks, that blastocyst starts imploding on one side, and it creates this thing called a neural groove, which turns into a neural tube, which turns into a brain and a spinal column. This begins during the 2nd week of life, at the end of the 2nd week of life. And from 3 to 8 weeks, all of the biological systems in your body begin developing. We call this beginning of development organogenesis. So your arm buds poke out, your leg buds poke out, your heart begins to develop, your lungs begin to develop, your digestive system, your brain starts to begin to develop. All of this happens starting in the second or the beginning of the third week of pregnancy. And if you look at that chart beneath me, you'll see these lines representing each of these systems: the central nervous system, the heart, the arms, the eyes, the legs, the teeth. And what you're going to see is that while all of these systems start sometime in the embryonic period, some of them don't finish for a long time. In fact, I'm going to argue that your nervous system is not fully done until you are 25 years of age. And yet your arms are going to be done by 10 weeks of gestation. And so, in a sense, everything starts during the embryonic period. Now, you're at your highest risk for miscarriage here, and if you ingest something that you shouldn't ingest, you might have birth defects, right? Problems with these systems that are developing. Now, from 8 weeks to 40 is what we call the fetal period. You go from being called an embryo to being called a fetus. Now, this is during the period when basically all of your systems are finishing, okay, and maturing, and you're picking up weight that you're going to need to be born. Now, if you're below 5.5 pounds, you may be diagnosed as a low birth weight babies. And you know what? Doctors are very, very interested in that, because low birth weight babies tend to have negative outcomes, negative cognitive and biological outcomes. Now, during this period, you might have birth defects or miscarriage is possible, although miscarriage is less likely during the fetal period. Okay, now, why do we care about these periods? Well, because we want to make sure that our babies do not get sick from anything the mother ingests. Okay, now, in the placenta, there's this maternal blood barrier system which prevents most molecules from getting from the mom's blood system to the baby's blood system. And it's sort of like a net that allows only the smallest molecules like carbon dioxide, oxygen, salt, and other useful molecules that need to go from the mom to the baby and the baby to the mom to pass through. However, there are certain drugs and chemicals that are small enough that they can get through this net and go from the mother system to the baby system. This class of drugs and these kinds of effects that can harm a developing baby are collectively called teratogens. Okay, environmental substances that can harm your baby's prenatal development. And if you look on page 135, you can get more information about some of these teratogens. Okay, now, and we're not going to talk about them, but I expect you to go in your book and at least be familiar with alcohol and prescription drugs and some of the other teratogenic substances that they say. All right. Now, these environmental substances can harm the prenatal development. But you know what? When I was being brought up, when my mom was pregnant with me, she actually used to sit with the doctor after her OB/GYN appointments, and they would share a cigarette together. She actually smoked a cigarette with her doctor back in the 60s. Now they'd run the doctor out of medicine for doing that. But back in the 60s, everybody smoked, and it wasn't necessarily seen as such a bad thing. So why did I turn out so normally, right? Or abnormally, as you might say, right? Why do some people get affected by teratogens and some people don't? Well, it depends on several things. Number one, it depends upon the dose of the teratogenic substance. The more you get, the worse you get. All right. Also, the genetic susceptibility. Some babies are more susceptible to teratogens than other teratogens. And the third one, and I want to talk about this a little bit, is timing. If you look at the chart down below me, you'll notice that we have these bars that represent the development of these biological systems. And you see the central nervous system goes from the beginning of 3 weeks all the way through the end of pregnancy and then on for 25 years, right? Now, the green part of the bar shows you when that developing system is most sensitive to teratogens. So, getting a drug or a teratogenic substance during the 4th week is going to be more harmful for your central nervous system than getting it at 12 or 16 or 20 weeks. Now, this doesn't mean you should take the teratogenic substance later, but basically what this shows you is when these systems are most sensitive to teratogenic substances. And if you'll notice, from 3 to 8 weeks is when most of your systems are most susceptible to teratogens. Most people don't even know they're pregnant by the end of 8 weeks. If you are planning to get pregnant, please, please, please do a little research and find out what kinds of things you need to avoid while you're thinking about getting pregnant, because you don't want to harm that beautiful developing baby that you have. Okay? Now, some babies are born premature before 37 weeks of gestation. This is not a good thing, and doctors try to keep your child from doing that as much as possible. In fact, there's a video I've got somebody, if anybody's interested in. There are mothers who are addicted to opiates. They actually prefer to keep them on methadone and other maintenance programs rather than remove them cold turkey from these drugs. Because when a pregnant mother is removed from these opiates, it causes contractions in the body that can lead to an early or a premature birth. And doctors would rather have your baby born addicted to an opiate rather than being a premature birth, because the long-term outcomes are actually better for your baby. Kids who are born prematurely have a higher infant mortality rate. They're more likely to have a physical disability, and you know what? Later on in school, they are more likely to show intellectual problems and school performance problems. Any questions so far? Hopefully I haven't scared you too much about babies, but you need to be very careful if you want to have the best chance of having a healthy and happy baby. Go ahead and type in the chat bar if you're still following me, folks. I see we have 26 viewers today. Thank you very much for your good audience, by the way. Now, on the last couple slides, I suggested to you that some of these brain systems do not mature for a long time, and I suggested to you that the nervous system doesn't finish developing until you're 25 years of age. How many of you are under 25? If you haven't, your brain isn't done yet, right? But it'll finish soon enough. I'm 50, so my brain is fully matured, and actually I'm probably sliding down the backside now. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, okay? Oh, there we go, Whitaker at 18. I'm so jealous. How is he going to be treated? Kira, be a little more specific in that question. You're talking about the newborn baby that's born addicted? They actually step them down. They sometimes give them a little bit of the opiate to sort of bring off the edge, and they slowly wean them off the drug, just like you would anybody who is addicted to an opiate. And as I said, they actually sometimes even give them a little bit of the opiate just to take the edge off the newborn baby. And not all babies go through this withdrawal period. And it's hard to predict which babies will show withdrawal symptoms and which babies won't show withdrawal symptoms. Good question, Kira K. All right, now, here's the deal. Your brain is going to develop, your nervous system and your intellectual abilities are going to develop over the next 25 years after you're born. And they're going to develop through two broad processes. And I kind of wanted you to be introduced to these. You know what these are, but I want to contrast them for you to think about the contrast. Human beings change two ways. Number one is they mature, and that means their brain unfolds along a genetic programmed path. Okay, so your arms grow, you grow taller, you go through puberty, you get facial hair if you're a guy, you grow breasts if you're a female, and you mature, and puberty and these other things occur no matter what the environment is, right? So one way we change is we mature. Human beings also change through environmental experiences and stimulation from the environment and changes in your behavior and thinking related to this environment. Let's call that learning. So does everybody see the difference between maturation and learning? Now, the neat thing about maturation and learning is you can actually tie them to biological processes that go on in the brain. And I'm going to start, I should have probably switched these around, but I'm going to start with maturation. Now, here's the thing. Your brain is born with all the different brain structures that you'll ever need and all the neurons that you'll ever need. However, human beings are the most helpless of animals at birth. So what's missing from the brain? You know what's missing from the brain? myelin tissue. Remember, we talked about that in chapter 2. That's that fatty tissue that wraps around axons. You're missing all of your myelin tissue. And so your brains, because they're trying to generate electrical impulses called action potentials, anytime you have wires that aren't insulated, they short circuit and they don't work very well. And in a sense, that's a rough metaphor that you can use for your brain and why you are so helpless at birth, is because you don't have the insulation on your axons to make your neural pathways work correctly. And what has to happen over the first, it happens a great deal during early childhood and middle childhood, and it slows down, but your brain is still packing on myelin tissue up until the age of 25 years. Now, the weird thing is, the parts of your brain that control your sensory and motor functions tend to myelinate first. Your motor cortex, sensory cortex, and your visual cortex are going to mature first. And what you'll notice is your parietal lobe, which is your critical thinking part of your brain, your memory down here in your temporal lobe, and your frontal lobe, which is your impulse control and your responsibility, is going to myelinate last. And as these different areas of the brain myelinate and grow this fatty tissue, those abilities that they control will become matured. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of ALS, amyotrophic sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease. This is a degenerative nerve disease in which the myelin tissue that's grown on your body begins to die off. Excuse me. And this is a fatal disease that leads to death, and it's related to this myelin tissue loss. So you really, really need your myelin in order for your body to work properly. All right. Now, and that's what happens as your brain matures. Now, here's an even crazier, weird scenario with regard to learning. Your brain actually changes as you stimulate it. And that's why it's important to play and talk and be around your baby. Now, you don't need to be teaching your baby 4 languages. You can if you want. You don't need to teach them math. You don't need to show them grammar or give them science at 1 year of age. All you really need to do is play with those babies, talk to them, make them laugh and giggle and look at things. And that stimulation causes the brain to change in a very fundamental way. You see, brains are connected by dendrites. Do you remember that from chapter 2? And the weird thing about dendrites is when one neuron stimulates another neuron, dendrites, those dendrites will start to grow towards the neuron that's stimulating them. We call this synaptic blooming. And if you look at the picture in the bottom left corner, you'll see that we have the same number of synapses at birth, 6 years old and 14 years of age. But what you're going to notice is that those neurons make much more, they make a ton of connections as you grow up. And we call this synaptic blooming. So as you stimulate a baby's arms and legs and eyes, those little neurons are going to knit together and make lots and lots of connections so that these two neural pathways can really communicate. Now, the weird thing is, during this period, you actually, after you make more neural connections that you're ever going to need, but then your brain learns to use a certain set of connections for that given ability. So the neural connections that it made that it doesn't use begin to die off. And this is called programmed synaptic death or synaptic pruning. So the weird thing about your brain is as you stimulate it, it creates lots of neural connections. It then decides which ones it can use best, and the ones that it developed that it doesn't want to use die off. So in a sense, your brain structures its architecture to fit the world that is stimulating it. What happens if they never die? That's a good question. You know what? I'm not sure if there's evidence of them not dying. I think the ones that you don't do because just wither. So the weird thing is, when a neuron stimulates another neuron, the second neuron kind of provides, if you will, the food that causes the first neuron to grow. And so I think if you don't have the stimulation, you just don't have the growth. That's a really good question, though. So does everybody understand the idea of blooming and pruning and how that relates to the environment? Right? So your baby's born and programmed, and they're going to change. They're going to develop these myelin pathways. And that's important, but you really need to stimulate your baby's brain so that these little dendrites grow. Now, this brain's ability to sort of program itself we call neuroplasticity. Why is this important? Sometimes the genetic instructions mess up, and your baby may be born missing a part of their brain. I remember I had a student in my class that was missing her left frontal lobe, and she was completely normal. She had been born without it. But what happened was her brain actually reprogrammed to give the bodily functions that it needed to a different part of the brain. So if your brain is damaged, if you're born with part of your brain damaged or missing, your brain will actually rewire itself to take care of the old function in a new part of the brain. We call this quality neuroplasticity. And this is why it's very important to identify developmental problems like autism or cognitive deficiencies as early in life. Because if you can provide therapeutic training, and sometimes the brain can rewire itself around a potential problem. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, in order to determine whether or not you're healthy or not healthy, your doctor wants to figure out if your nervous system is developing normally. If your nervous system doesn't develop normally, then you may not develop normally. So how are we going to do that without actually looking in a baby's brain to see if their myelin tissue is developing or if their synapses are growing together? It's expensive to do that by looking inside the brain, but we can do it relatively cheaply by looking at the behaviors that a baby should be doing. Now, a fellow named Arnold Giselle, way back in the 1930s, realized that children seem to develop along the same pathway, doing about the same abilities at the same time. And he developed these he identified these prototypical behaviors and named them milestones. So milestones is any ability that most kids can do at a given age. Okay? And what he found was there was a range when milestone behaviors usually appeared in normal children. So most children are going to learn to raise their head. They're going to learn to take control of their head within 1 to 3 months of age. Most kids are going to learn to roll over sometime between 2.5 and 4 months. And what he realized, he had the insight, is that if you know how these patterns of behaviors develop over the course of a lifespan, you can use them as a gauge for whether or not the child's nervous system is developing normally. If the child doesn't hit the milestone or they start regressing on milestones, you as a doctor know that something's wrong, and you may go in and look a little more deeply to see if there's a problem and how you can treat it. Now, in milestone expectation, we typically have a range, and it goes from what 10% of the children can do at a time to what 90% of the children can do at a given age. And so what your doctor is looking for when you take them in for your 3-month checkup, your 4-month checkup, your 6-month checkup, the doctor is listening for you to talk about milestone behaviors. Now, you think the doctor is just interested in hearing about the cute things your kid can do, and you might be right, but the doctor is also listening for milestone behaviors. And they're going to get nervous if your child is way, way, way behind, or more importantly, stops and goes back. Now, if your child is born early, 3 weeks early, their milestones occur 3 weeks later. And you know what? Just like some of you are always late to class, some people are always late to your milestones. So even if your child is a month late for every milestone, but they're still moving through them, the doctor doesn't get worried. The doctor only gets worried as if your child is way behind, or sometimes children will hit milestones and then go back, losing milestone behaviors. That happens sometimes when doctors diagnose autism or autistic spectral disorders, okay? Now, there are lots of milestones in the world that developmental psychologists use. They look at your motor behaviors, your big muscles, being able to move your trunk and your arms and your legs, and fine motor milestones like being able to use pincer grasp. This develops around 1 year of age. And they also look at mental milestones, what children should be able to do mentally at given ages, 3, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months. And they also look at their socio-emotional. For autism, We look for children not hitting their socio-emotional or personality development milestones as the first sign that the child might have some sort of autistic spectral disorder. And then there are language milestones. And so what I want you to know, just for the test maybe, is that below you see what we would call gross motor milestones. No, there isn't. That's a good question, Lily. Lily wants to know if there's a problem with developing too fast. No. Again, as long as you're heading through the milestones and hitting them smoothly. Now, if you super speed up and then all of a sudden you stop and move back a little bit, the doctor doesn't want to see that. What they want to see is you moving in one direction, Lily. Fast is okay. A little slow is okay, just as long as you're hitting milestones. Now, the chart you see below me is what we would call the gross motor milestone behaviors. You'll notice that children learn to cruise, which is walking, holding on to something, around 9 months. Kids learn to crawl and creep around 10 months. Did you know there are 25 different identifiable crawling styles? Not all children crawl forward. Some children crawl backwards. Some children crawl on their butt. Some children crawl on their belly. There are 25 different ways that children crawl, starting around 10 months. Most kids are going to walk and say their first word around 12 months. That's something I might like you to stick in your head. Most kids walk or say their first word around 12 months. Okay, and don't worry if your 14-month-old nephew isn't saying his or her first words yet. Maybe they have parents that take care of all their needs and they haven't decided they need to talk yet, right? All right, now, that was sort of the physical development. And I want to slip over real quick and talk a little bit about cognitive development. Remember, I suggested to you that human development occurs in 3 domains: physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional. Here, I'm going to talk about one aspect of cognitive development we call the development of language. All right, now, psychologists would say, the basic thought of psychologists is that there's something you might call a language acquisition device in all people. It's not a real structure per se. Instead, it's more of an inherent capability to learn language if exposed to it early in life. Think about this. Some people never learn to read. Some people can't do a bit of math. Some people can't find their way from point A to point B. But everybody learns how to talk without even being taught. Really, we just sort of pick it up as long as we experience it early in life. Now, so we would argue that there's this inherent ability for human beings to accept language. However, there is a critical period for language, and actually there's critical periods for everything. We typically talk about critical periods in developmental psychology as being a period when the brain needs to be stimulated for an ability to develop normally. Okay? So we need to have certain parts of our brain stimulated at specific times to kick off a developmental epoch. And there is actually a critical period for language. I've provided you a video in your course resources folder that shows what happens if you miss the critical period for language. And it follows the story of Jeannie Wiley, a girl from California who grew up in a horribly abusive household where her dad locked her in a bedroom for the first 11 years of her life and never let anybody talk to her. He chained her to her crib and fed her through a door and wouldn't let the family say anything to her. And when she was found at 11 years old, she couldn't speak a word. And it turns out that Jeannie Wiley was never able to learn how to speak a language because she had missed her critical period for language. If any of you are from another country and you've had English-speaking people try to speak your language and they can't speak it right, or if any of you are born with another language and have come here to the United States and you can't figure out how to say a certain English word or not, it turns out that there is a critical period for phonemes. Infants learn how to distinguish the sounds of their language at about the age of 9 months. Up until about 9 months, you can hear in all the sounds in any given language. A unit of sound is called a phoneme. But starting at about 9 months, you lose the ability to hear phoneme differences that are not used in your language. So little Hispanic babies brought up in Spanish-speaking countries develop their own set of phonemes. English-speaking babies develop their own set of phonemes. Those of you from Arabic countries, you learn Arabic phonemes. And each language kind of loses the ability to hear the differences and to really speak like a native person, beginning at the age of 9 months. How is that? Is that amazing or what? Actually, I should go ahead and give you a wow on that one. That's so crazy. Right? Now, language develops in sort of let's talk about 3 different kinds of language. Receptive language, which is being able to understand language. Okay, that's the ability to understand what is said. It usually precedes productive language, which is the ability to speak. And in fact, some parents think that they can or like to teach their kids to sign language, because kids actually can form words through sign language before that they can say them sometimes. So receptive language usually precedes productive language. All right. And so children learn to understand words, then they learn to speak them. And then the final part of learning language is pragmatics, which is how to carry on a good conversation, how to understand how to talk properly to a certain person. If you folks were talking to me, you would talk differently than if you were speaking to a 2-year-old, right? Because you understand you have to use different language for a 2 or a 3-year-old than you do for a college professor, right? If you know how to carry on a conversation, right, and keep the conversation on track, you understand what we'll call pragmatics. And this is sort of the practical knowledge for how to have a conversation. This is actually the last ability to develop, and sometimes you'll see 4 and 5 and 6-year-old kids saying things in public that are very embarrassing to the parent because they don't understand that sometimes you shouldn't say certain things, right? Look at that funny man, or look at that spot on that man's face, or things like that, and the parent gets so embarrassed. It's because the kid doesn't understand what you should and shouldn't say in a conversation, right? Now, if you look right below me, you'll see sort of the expectations and verbal milestones for the first several years of a child's life. The first thing kids learn to do is vocalize. They just learn to move those vocal cords, and that leads to cooing, the ga-ga, goo-goo, ah kind of stuff. The really cute cooing that kids do. Then, starting around 6 to 10 months, kids actually begin practicing their consonants. Ba-ba-ba, da-da-da, ga-ga-ga, la-la-la-la-la, and they will do what we call babbling, right? Typically around 12 months, your kid's going to say their first word. My oldest son's first word was dog, not dad, not mom, not I love you, but dog. I couldn't believe this. His first word at 12 months. And then starting around 18 months of age, children learn how to put 2 words together to make their first sentences. More milk. Doggy scared. Mommy sad. Those are telegraphic speeches, not real sentences, but they're 2 words together that convey some sort of meaning or idea. And then the weird thing is, kids about the age of 18 months to 2 years, suddenly your kid will go from saying 12 or 13 words at 18 months to being able to have full conversations at 24 months. We call this the vocabulary explosion, and it happens during the second half of the second year. And then children around 3 to 5 years of age begin to understand how to take turns in conversation, how to keep a conversation on track. And kids who are 5 years old even know that they have to speak differently to a 2-year-old than they have to speak to an adult personality. So just like physical milestones, language abilities develop in this very predictable pattern that's related to learning and maturation. Does everybody understand that so far? Okay, I hope so. If you are still following me, I have 24 people, not a bad crowd. Is everybody still interested? Is this okay? It's kind of hard to see. Type me in the chat bar. Why can still talk like natives? Well, that's the thing. If you hear that sound when you're a baby, Kira, even if you grow up somewhere else, you're able to learn to sound like a native. I could learn to speak Arabic, but there's no way I could ever learn to sound like an Arabic person. On the other hand, if you spent your first couple of years in Saudi Arabia and then moved to the United States, you would be able to learn, and you decided to learn Arabic later, or you went back, well, actually, by 2 years, you'd have learned Arabic. You would be able to learn Arabic even, or sound like an Arabic person, even if you lived in the United States. Okay? I hope that answered your question, Kira. Now, remember I talked about biological development and biological milestones? I talked about cognitive development and language milestones. Developmental psychologists are also interested in emotional milestones and emotional development. And one of the most important emotional milestones is called attachment. Turns out humans are born incredibly helpless, right? And so they really rely on a primary caregiver. They're not like frogs or fish or snakes that are born and slither away from their parents, never to see them again. Because those animals are born with complete nervous systems. Human beings need a lot of time and a lot of care until their nervous systems develop. So it is an evolutionarily the relationship, a close relationship and a love between an infant and a primary caregiver is a fundamental mammalian need that serves an evolutionary purpose. If babies weren't so damn cute and we just threw them out after we had them, no babies would survive. But babies are cute and they smell good, so we take care of them even when they poop in their diapers and they cry and they annoy us because they're so stinking cute. This process of bonding between a primary caregiver and an infant is called attachment. And this attachment process is a very critical part that has to occur in the first years of life in order for you to develop the ability to have normal relationships with other people in the world. Failure during this period can lead to what we call attachment disorders. And if you Google attachment disorders, you'll see that there's an area of clinical psychology that treats children who don't have the ability to form normal human attachments. Now, the early question was, why do humans bond with their parents? Is it for food or love? It turns out that in the 1950s, people thought that babies loved their moms simply because their moms provided them the food. But this guy named Harry Harlow did a really crazy experiment to demonstrate that it's more than about food. It's about love and emotion. And so what he did was he took these rhesus monkeys, cruel study, and separated them from their mothers at birth. He did not let them see another live monkey. Instead, he gave them 2 monkeys in their cage. One that was a soft, cuddly mother covered in down, like you see here in the bottom left. And one of them was a wire monkey that wasn't very comfortable, but had a nipple and a food bottle. And he would feed the baby through the wire mother and not feed the baby through the cloth mother. And what he found was that the infants preferred the cloth mother to the wire mother, and in fact spent up to 20 hours a day huddled on the warm, cuddly mom. The only time they went over to the wire mom was to get the food, and they would go straight back and snuggle on the cuddly mom. And what he realized is that the attachment, the relationship between a caregiver and caregiver and a baby is all about comfort. Now, here's the thing. You're born with this amygdala, and you have these emotional responses, but your amygdala and your emotional pathways aren't fully wired, so it's hard for you to control your emotions. When you're scared and having bad emotions, your body releases cortisol, a stress hormone, which is not good for you. It prevents you from looking around and exploring and stimulating your brain, and stress hormones for the long term are detrimental to the human body. And so the attachment allows the baby to control their emotions. They feel comfortable again. The stress hormone drops and they become exploratory, stimulating their brain. So attachment allows a baby to develop their intellectual abilities, and it also allows them to control the negative arousal that is dangerous to their bodies. Does that make sense? Okay. So, now, Harry Harlow studied monkeys, and you can't separate human babies from their moms permanently at birth. It's just cruel, and you can't do that. But a lady named Mary Ainsworth decided to set up an experiment to see if she could differentiate between children's different attachment styles. And what she realized is that children go through two very normal fears from about 6 months to 3 years. Parents who don't know this are sometimes embarrassed by their kids' behavior, but this is a normal part of human development. Starting from about 6 months to 3 years, children become afraid of strangers, and they also become very afraid of being separated from their mom. If you've ever seen a mother leave a 1-year-old baby alone and walk into the next room, the baby often crawls after the mother crying. And they demonstrate what's called separation protest. They cry because they're afraid of being away from their mom. Now, this lady, Mary Ainsworth, wanted to see how if children differed in their ability to reattach to the primary caregiver. Because you notice most children, when the mom or primary caregiver comes back in the room, the kid quits crying, but not all children quit crying. She wanted to see if she could demonstrate different ways that children attach to their primary caregivers. So she came up with an experiment, and I've also got a video of this in the resources folder, called the Strange Situation. She brings kids into a lab. It's a laboratory observational study. Remember that from chapter 1. And she would have the child and the room, mom come into the room, and then she would have the primary caregiver get up and leave the room. And she would have a stranger come in the room while the primary caregiver was gone. And she set it up so that the baby was alone and with the primary caregiver 2 different times. And every time the primary caregiver came back in the room, she measured how the child responded to the mother coming back in the room. That is, how easily the child was able to reestablish attachment. And she found that there were 3 broad styles in which that children demonstrated when the primary caregiver came back in the room. I'm sorry, I'm being sexist here. Dads can be primary caregivers too. All right. The first, most of these children, when the primary caregiver came back in the room, they quickly quit crying and quickly resumed their exploratory behavior. She said that these children had secure attachments. On the other hand, some of these children seemed to be mad at the primary caregiver when the primary caregiver came back in the room and wouldn't make eye contact and seemed to push the primary caregiver away. She called these children avoidant. And she found that there was a third group. These children seemed to be super duper clingy. And when the primary caregiver came back in the room, they held on for dear life, but they couldn't stop crying and they had trouble beginning their exploratory behavior. She called these children anxious, ambivalent children. And she believed that this was due to caregiver responsiveness. Can you spoil a child during the first year? No. What you want to do during the first year is make them comfortable being themselves and being alone, and you do that by meeting their needs anytime they're afraid. If they know that somebody's going to help them when they get afraid, then they learn not to be afraid when they are alone. And she argued that caregiver responsiveness can help children develop into secure attachment styles. Now, the crazy thing is, later researchers found that your infant attachment style may predict how well you attach to older adults when you develop romantic relationships. How many of you have ever had a clingy romantic partner that has to call you 15 times a day and needs constant reassurance that you still love them, right? You may have a person with an ambivalent romantic attachment style. How many of you have had a romantic partner that just won't share anything with you and just doesn't seem to go to you when they need consoling and they seem to brood and suffer alone? You may have an avoidant relationship partner. And hopefully most of you have a secure relationship partner that loves you when you're around but can be separated from you without getting super duper anxious, but at the same time shares things with you. They would call that a secure attachment style. There you go. I see some people typing me in here. Okay, and so that's, if you will, a socio-emotional development milestone which occurs. I actually should have moved this screen earlier. And you know, you know what? I might talk about this next week. Let's go ahead and end the class because I'm at 11 minutes and 51 seconds. Did everybody enjoy the lecture today? Was it a good time? Thank you. No need for applause. Oh my goodness, thank you very much. I am sorry to keep you 52 minutes. It was great to see each and every one of you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a remind text. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday at 11 o'clock. Take care and have a great day.